Hello, everyone. My name is Howard Rosenblum, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the National Association of the Deaf. I'm delighted to be here with you today to talk a little bit about the consumer's perspective on video remote interpreting. So I'd like to share a little bit about what this means for the consumer and also for the industry that provides VRI services. So let's take a look at the first slide. As you see, I'm going to be covering 4 areas in my presentation. I'll be talking first about the consumer's needs and view of VRI and as it applies to real-world, everyday kinds of circumstances. So I'll be talking about this in 4 different areas. First, the legal mandates, and then secondly, what we call the regulatory requirements, which are basically the way that the law is interpreted in general with specifics in regards to how the law can be complied by. So those are the regulations that I'll be covering. Thirdly, I'll move into the consumer's concerns, understanding, of course, there are laws and regulations, but how does it actually work itself out in real life for individuals who are using VRI services? And typically where VRI services are used, primarily in the medical, legal, business, and educational areas. So how those VRI services are used and actually work throughout each of those arenas in everyday life. And the NAD, the National Association of the Deaf, also has some best practices in how VRI can be used in everyday kinds of circumstances in each of those 4 areas I've mentioned: medical, legal, business, and then also educational. So that's what I'll be covering in my presentation today. Next slide, please. As you see on this slide, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, has been around since 1990 and has required certain compliance issues in a variety of different areas. There are 4 titles to the ADA, the first one being Title I, or Part 1, and that covers issues related to employment. The second title, or Part 2, pertains to public entities, meaning state or local government entities. Part 3 is primarily focused on what we call public accommodations. And by public accommodations, we're talking about any private business that's open to general public use. And I'll talk more about that. Title 4 is not something we're going to go into a lot of detail right now, but it's about telecommunications. And it's the requirement for relay services that have been available since 1990. Mainly speaking here of video relay services, VRS, which is very different from VRI services. VRS services pertain to telecommunications, individuals using the phone lines to communicate with one another, whereas VRI is more person-to-person communications through video remote interpreting services. So let me speak a little bit too about Title I, which pertains to employment issues. Employers are required to comply with ADA if they have 15 or more employees who are working for that agency. If there's less than 15, they do not have to comply with the ADA requirements. So 15 is the key number. And the requirements for individuals in terms of accommodations under the ADA is that the employers have to require or provide reasonable accommodations to their employees, meeting that individual's needs so that they can perform their work duties effectively. And for deaf people, that means communication, meaning the provision of qualified sign language interpreters. So that's what's covered under Title I of the ADA. Title II and III, actually Title II is more about the government entity, and III is about public entities that are available to the public. The ADA requires that in each of these titles, that effective communication accessibility is made available through the provision of what's called auxiliary aids and services. And the regulations speak more specifically to what those auxiliary aids and services are. But primarily speaking, these titles pertain to effective communication being provided. So for the deaf and hard of hearing person, those services have to be provided so that individuals who can hear can communicate with them in such a way that they're able to communicate on par and receive services and communications just like their hearing peers. And that's what's determined to be effective communication. And how that actually works itself out is something I'll be going into here in a bit. So those are the three titles under the ADA that requires communication access in each of those different entities. And again, by communication access, we're talking about interpreting services, and specifically for this presentation, interpreting services through VRI. Next slide, please. What you see here is a regulation requirement. So once the ADA was passed and required effective communication be provided, there were different regulations that spelled out exactly how that was to happen. Title 2 and 3 also speak to auxiliary aids and services. And as has been the case, interpreters in general were considered to be part of those reasonable accommodations as long as they were qualified. Now, a couple of years ago, there was further language that was added because since the passage back in 1990, VRI has become now more prevalent. It wasn't the case back in 1990, so now that VRI is on the scene, regulations now require or stipulate what we need by VRI. Anything that will be available to help deaf and hard of hearing people receive communications from whatever kind of provider that might be through are now required to follow the regulations. The regulations stipulate a qualified interpreter be provided on-site or through VRI services. So it provides the option for either kinds of services, on-site or VRI. And those are considered auxiliary aids that will assist in communication effectiveness. Once again, part of the regulation. So let's take a look at the next slide. The wording is fairly extensive in this piece of regulation, but let's take a look at what the regulation actually requires. Again, we're talking here about effective communication for deaf and hard of hearing people. Providing VRI is not simply sufficient enough. The regulations have 4 specific areas that have to be covered. One in parentheses, and that first one says that the provider must provide real-time, immediate interpreting services, not in delayed way, and it has to be with full motion and full video. So the communication can happen both ways. The deaf person has to be able to see the video, and the interpreter has to be able to see and hear the deaf person. So the video and audio quality have to be of high standards, and it has to be assured that that quality is coming through high-speed rating, meaning the bandwidth has to be sufficient enough to transmit clear communications. It can't be in a stilted form because that certainly is not clear enough, so it has to be high quality, real time, almost near exact image video quality and audio quality without any delay or any kind of blurriness or graininess of the picture that's being transmitted. So once again, the emphasis here is on real time and also on high quality VRI services. The interpreter has to be assured that they are able to communicate and see and hear clearly enough, as well as the person on the other end. The deaf person has to be able to see enough, and the audio channel also has to be delivered in such a way that it's immediately accessible to the hearing consumer. Now let's look at number 2. Number 2 really requires that the video screen be large enough so that you're able to access the interpreter's face, arms, hands, so that the person can see very clearly all of that as well as the interpreter's fingers, allowing for ease of communication through visual communications. And the same holds true for the person on the other end of the line. The deaf individual must be able to be seen clearly by the interpreter, so the interpreter is able to see a nice part of the individual's torso, including their face, arms, hands, and fingers. So clear communication is assured through both channels. And this is regardless of the individual's body position. And this is primarily important for medical situations. If you think about a person who's lying in bed, or is in some kind of pain and is doubled over, perhaps they're on the floor, in whatever position that individual is, the screen or camera has to be located in such a way that the positioning allows for clear communication to be available through the video screen. Even if the person is doubled over in some way, The camera needs to be positioned so the interpreter is able to see that person clearly. If it cannot be done in such a way that it's clear, then that's considered to be ineffective communications. And this is not just, you might think, for medical situations, can also be in situations where a person is in jail, the person may be handcuffed, it might be difficult for the interpreter to see if the position of the camera cannot be adjusted, or it might hold true as well for a child, where the camera has to be positioned lower than what might be necessary so that the individual can see what the child is signing, and also the TV screen needs to be lowered so that the child can easily access the visual TV screen. Let's take a look at the next slide. The last two parts of the regulations for VRI speak to what we refer to here as number 3, where there's a very clear, audible transmission of voices. So, of course, with VRI, a deaf person might be in one location, and the hearing provider, whether it be an attorney, and a doctor, or an employer, is in the same room with that deaf individual, viewing the VRI screen. It needs to be situated in such a way that the deaf person's signs are clearly visible to the interpreter on the other side of the screen, while at the same time, the hearing person's spoken communication has to be audible and understandable by the interpreter on the other end of the line, so that the interpreter can clearly hear and see what's being done. So both video and audio channels have to be clearly transmitted so that effective communication can occur. Now, the fourth part of this stipulates that individuals who are providing VRI services have to be adequately trained. So the deaf individual and the hearing provider may not know how to situate the VRI, to turn it on, to make sure that the line is connected and that full streamer is coming through, and that they are able to troubleshoot should there be a video problem or audio problem. So that other individuals, whether it be in the hospital or medical office, a law office, or in the courts or prison, or in a particular area of business or corporation or company, have to be assured that they can provide these kinds of assurances. And this holds true as well for educational settings, colleges and universities. Staff have to be available on call to be able to adjust the VRI screen, to make sure the video and audio channel are working effectively, that everything is in focus, and that the streams are going through high-speed internet, so that we're not actually sharing bandwidth with other kinds of resources that may drain or degrade the quality of the stream. So it's very important to have that person available. In a hospital, for example, this person needs to be on staff 24/7. So that if a deaf individual is brought to the hospital at 3 in the morning and needs VRI services, because the interpreter is not available to be live in person, a person needs to be available on call to come in and be able to set that VRI service up. Once again, making sure the audio and visual channels are clear. Let's take a look at the next slide. So I've spoken a lot about the laws and regulations and how VRI services should be most effectively established. But now I'd like to speak a bit to what deaf and hard of hearing people experience. So let's move on to the next slide. As you see here on this slide, just having laws and regulation is really not sufficient enough to make sure that the laws are complied by are most effective in every situation. So it's very important to look to the deaf consumer to determine whether or not VRI is going to be an effective way for communicating. Deaf and hard of hearing people need to be part of that decision. Of course, the hearing entity is required to provide the service, but it's the deaf person's ability and their take on whether or not it's most effective as to whether or not VRI services should be provided. The ADA does require VRI be available as an option, but deaf persons should be consulted to determine whether it's most effective. Again, the hearing consumers have to make sure that they're complying with all of the regulations that have just been described in terms of the quality of sound and video, but it is up to the consumer to determine whether or not their needs are going to be met and whether or not this communication is most effective through VRI, if they're able to understand and be able to accommodate and access the information. If VRI is able to be situated in such a way that the deaf person feels satisfied that they're getting equal and adequate communication, then VR can be used. So most importantly here is we need to make sure that deaf and hard of hearing people are brought into the equation and the discussion as to whether or not VRI might be a best option or not. It may not always be the best option, and let me tell you a little bit about why that might be the case. If you think about the fact of accessing communication through a visual channel, through a video TV screen, it's going to be delivered in 2D as opposed to 3D, We're used to watching that kind of communication through video vlogs that we've seen, but most of the time people are used to communicating in person through a 3D kind of communication channel where we can see one another very easily. Depth perception is easily understood when you're working with a person live. And if you think about a situation such as a medical situation or a legal situation, taking away that 3D effect and making it 2D can create some concerns and added stress for the deaf consumer. Positioning of the screen for VRI accessibility is often difficult. If you imagine a deaf person lying in bed, it's not easy to access the TV screen when the screen is in front of their face, above them on the bed, or if they don't have their eyeglasses on and maybe have a hard time seeing. In that situation, a person who is live in person might be easier because the deaf person could instruct the interpreter to move closer so that they could see. That's not always the case that it's available for the VRI. There are issues with technology. Sometimes the technology, for whatever reason, disconnects or it doesn't work or has to be reconnected. And deaf, hard of hearing persons, I know, and even hearing people will use video phones or Skype to communicate with one another. So you've all experienced situations where suddenly the image becomes distorted or difficult to see and blurry. The same can happen through VRI. So if that happens, you often have to wait until the screen once again readjusts and that picture is clear. And the same can happen with the audio. So for these reasons, in a very stressful situation, medical or legal situations, deaf people may be reluctant or resistant to use VRI. So once again, this speaks to the need for making sure that deaf and hard of hearing consumers are consulted as to whether or not VRI is the most effective way of delivering communication. Having technology individuals available on staff who are able to address any technical needs that may arise, and not just staffing those kinds of services 9 to 5. People need to be available 24 hours a day so that we are able to repair VRI concerns should they arise. And VRI is not always the only option that should be available. We need to make sure that the person is available to fix the need should in fact VRI be the choice that the deaf person chooses. Also very critical, and something we've talked a bit about already, what's necessary to make VRI effective in terms of the technical ends of things is one piece of the pie, but the interpreter is another major component. The interpreter skills also need to be on par, because you can have the best technology available, but if the interpreter is not adequately qualified, the services are also not going to be effective. So it's important to make sure both the technology and the interpreter's qualifications are on par and up to the deaf person's standard. Just as would be true if an on-site interpreter is determined to be qualified, they're able to function effectively, the same holds true for VRI. The deaf person needs to be able to understand what the deaf person is communicating, and the interpreter needs to be able to understand the deaf person. So this is also another major component of providing adequate services through VRI. So 3 considerations must be given to determine whether or not an interpreter is qualified. First off, communication has to be effective through the interpreter from both parties involved. So the deaf person and the hearing person involved must be able to understand effectively what's being communicated. The second stipulation is that the interpretation must be accurate. The interpreter is able to understand very clearly what's being communicated visually and through the auditory channel, and is able to deliver an accurate interpretation. There should be no miscommunications or miscues. The information may be clear, but however incorrect. So that is to be avoided. The information rather must be accurate. Thirdly, the interpretation must be impartial. The interpreter can in no way interject their personal feelings or opinions. They have to remain neutral and uninvolved in the communication event. They're simply there to facilitate the communication, and this being the case, family members or others with a vested interest cannot provide the interpreting services. The interpreter is there just to make sure communication happens. And that holds true. These 3 stipulations hold true whether or not the interpreter is live in person or being VRI interpretation is provided. Typically with an on-site interpreter, you'll find very often that they and the deaf consumer come from the same regional area. Perhaps they're from New York or Chicago, San Francisco, maybe a rural area, wherever it might be, the interpreter and the deaf consumer reside in the same location. And as a result, they're able to understand one another very easily. Now, this is not the case for VRI. With VRI, interpreters may actually reside in a different state and therefore leading to regional signs that can create misunderstandings. Individuals who make use of VRI services must be sure to have a variety of different interpreters with varying qualifications that are able to meet the various regions of the United States and the communications and signs accordingly. So if a VRI interpreter is attempting to provide communication and realize they're ineffective, they can call upon another VRI interpreter who could then replace them. That's one of the advantages of VRI. It's quick and easy to replace the interpreter, much more so than it would be able to replace a person who's on site. Let's take a look at the next slide. As a representative of the National Association of the Deaf, I'm able to share with you some of the best practices that we have come up with as an entity. One of those best practices is that VRI remains as an option. VRI is not the one solution for every situation. VRI is one of many solutions that might be available for any given situation. So at this time, I can talk about VRI in 4 different areas: medical, legal, educational, and business. And I can see VRI being useful in each of those different areas if, in fact, it meets the needs of the deaf individuals involved and the hearing individuals involved. Most importantly, we want to make sure that options are available for either VRI or on-site interpreting services, and that they determined which services used based on the deaf person's need and deaf person's preference. Sometimes VRI may not be the preference or the best fit for the deaf person in any given situation. It might be effective for one person, but not necessarily for another person. So each person brings their individual need and as a result need to have options made available to them. One person may work effectively in one situation through VRI, but then in a different situation, maybe VRI will not be the best option. So it's important to understand that VRI is simply an option that may be effective in a given situation for a particular given individual. And it should be a temporary fix. So let me give you an example. If a deaf person goes to a hospital in an emergency situation, there is no advance notice that an interpreter is needed. They show up in the hospital emergency room and are looking for effective communication. Bringing in a live interpreter may require 2 or 3 or even 5 hours lag time, or maybe even a day, especially if this is a rural hospital. Or if it's 3 in the morning, it is difficult to find an interpreter who's able to get up at that hour and be at the hospital quickly. In that situation, VRI might be effective. Once again, if the technology is effective, if the image is very clear, VRI can be used while at the same time an on-site interpreter is being called. So as a stopgap measure, VRI may be effective until the on-site interpreter is actually available and present. So the NAD is looking to VRI as a temporary usage for, and if it's determined to be most effective, just as a stopgap measure until the interpreter is able to be live and present. So once again, really focusing on VRI as a temporary measure, and then not using that unless the live interpreter is not available. It's also important, while at the same time that we're meeting all of the technical issues, as I've mentioned earlier, all of the challenges we've talked about, having people who are technically savvy available to repair and remediate any kinds of technical issues may come up. Let's look at the next slide. I've spoken earlier about consumers' concerns about technology not being as dependable as you might hope and not always providing clear images. But in legal, medical, educational, and employment settings, again, it's very important to have technical staff available. There may be an IT person who is very familiar with using computers, and there might be an assumption that this person would equally be adequate to repairing or setting up VRI before. But if they've never seen this kind of equipment, they may need a bit of training. That's why we emphasize the need for individuals to know how to use the VRI, to know the audio, the visual, to understand the importance of the bandwidth and the streaming, knowing how to upload and download the signal, and then be able to troubleshoot an issue should an issue arrive. So someone needs to be familiar with the equipment, know how to adjust it accordingly, and if that person is not available 24 hours a day in each of the settings I've mentioned, business, medical, educational, and legal, then there needs to be individual plans as backup plans so that somebody is available. Understandably, the person can't be there 24 hours a day, but other individuals need to be trained so that they can be fallen back on whenever a situation, if a situation should occur. Understanding, of course, someone can't be there 24/7, but somebody on each of the shifts needs to know how and work with VRI. And it's important to have more than one person. Take a hospital, for example. You don't just have one x-ray machine or one staff person operating that x-ray machine, but a variety of individuals who are able to provide that service. And it's also necessary to have refresher courses because a one-time training is not sufficient. 3 months may go by before that person uses the service, and so therefore they may not remember how to use it. So refresher training is also very important. And VRI service providers also need to make sure that when they provide VRI services that they have interpreters that are able to accommodate a variety of different needs, that are familiar with regional signs, and also necessary vocabularies. And those all pertain to those 4 areas I mentioned: legal, medical, educational, and employment. Interpreters must be able to meet the needs in each of those settings for a variety of different situations that may occur in each. So medical can be a very complex situation. Imagine an interpreter meeting a deaf person who has a very different signing style. Perhaps they're a foreign-born deaf person or they come from another state. So they have to negotiate language in that sense, and also they have to be ready for any medical situation that may arise. Maybe a deaf person has lost an arm, is diabetic, is having a heart attack, or is in active labor. It could be the person has cancer. There are a variety of different situations. Maybe a person is a rape victim. The interpreter has to be ready and capable of addressing each of these situations as they occur in a medical setting, any time of day, 24/7. As we know, hospitals operate on that kind of a setting 24/7 because emergencies can happen at any point in time. Doctors' offices are less critical, less crisis in nature, but nonetheless, interpreters still must be knowledgeable about the medical field. Mistakes in this area could lead to misdiagnosis, miscommunications, and wrong assessments and inaccurate medications given that could lead to death or injury or some kind of bodily harm as a result of an inaccurate interpretation. So for this reason, of course, interpreters in this setting need to be very well versed in the medical field and also in that particular setting. The same holds true in a legal setting. Legal settings might involve a deaf person meeting with their attorney in their office, could be a deaf person going to court, or in jail or prison. I would say for any legal setting, an on-site interpreter is most preferred just due to the complexity of legal issues that might be discussed and making sure deaf people understand their rights. However, if necessary, if there's a last-minute emergency, maybe a deaf person, for example, has been arrested for a crime, and they're taken from that point into court for an arraignment hearing. This is their first opportunity to meet before the judge after their arrest, and they, at that point, will be assigned an attorney, or perhaps a public defender or another person would be assigned to represent them. In this instance, it might be the first opportunity for the court to realize the individual is deaf, and for that circumstance, VRI may be effective. More and more court systems, in fact, are using this for hearing prisoners who want to talk with a judge or an attorney. From their cell, they're able to do so through a video channel. And the same concept then would hold true for a deaf person communicating through VRI to access the service. So with the arraignment situation, as the deaf person faces the judge, not having a VRI service might mean that they're detained longer in jail. So VRI will allow for optimum communication to happen on a superficial level, making sure that the deaf person understands very clearly everything's working well in terms of the audio and video channel, and that everyone is able to understand, the interpreter can understand the deaf person, effective communication can be achieved, and if all of those circumstances are met, then VRI can be used in a court situation. Now moving to educational settings where you've got either children in K-12 settings or college settings. I can't imagine having a deaf child watching a VRI interpreter all day long as they're being educated. Just imagine the eye strain that would create. So on-site interpreters would be better for that situation. But I can imagine a situation where there's just a quick need for an interpreter to access a deaf person's meeting to make sure communication is effective. I know VRI services are used in an educational setting at a college or university if the ongoing interpreter is ill and unable to be there. As a backup plan, the VRI can be used. Again, if you were to use VRI on a daily basis, that could create a lot of eye strain. So I can imagine some situations where VRI might be effective in an educational setting. Perhaps if the deaf student wants to meet with a dean or a faculty member or someone in the department, maybe for just a 15-minute or half-hour meeting, VRI may be an effective way to allowing that communication to happen as opposed to bringing an on-site person. Once again, checking always to make sure that this is effective and acceptable to both deaf person and hearing people involved, because that's what we're always getting at is the most effective communication. In the business world, if we're thinking about a corporation or an employer who's hired a deaf person, the deaf employee, rather consumer, but employee, wants to be able to meet with their boss or wants to be able to, access other entities like a bank to apply for a loan or maybe to apply for a job, and may need immediate communication. In this case, VRI might be an effective way to make that communication happen if the channels are clear and if the deaf person is acceptable to 2D communication as opposed to 3D communication, and the internet connection can be made available. VRI might be effective in that situation. I have seen VRI used very often for weekly meetings, staff meetings, say, that last for 15 minutes. It's difficult to bring in an on-site interpreter for that. VRI might be an alternative in that situation. So VRI can be hooked up, staff meeting goes for 15 minutes once a week, and that might be an effective way to access that staff meeting. So this is just another idea or way that VRI can be effective. Also, for thinking about rural areas where it's difficult to find qualified interpreters, VRI might be a way to make that happen. The deaf person needs some kind of health treatment. They want to see a professional mental health situation. Maybe the deaf person is not able to find an interpreter in that area. If there is an interpreter who is able to understand these kinds of situations, is well versed in mental health situations, VRI might be an effective way for that deaf person to access their counselor. Once again, the interpreter would have to be very familiar with mental health situations and terminology being used. And if that is the case, then VRI might be an effective tool for communication. This all goes back to, though, this point I wanted to reiterate about the importance of having it as an option, the importance of making sure that both parties are accepting of the technology, that the interpreter is able to accommodate and meet the needs of everyone involved. And with these factors in place, VRI can be a very effective way to provide communication, making sure that they're able to comply with ADA regulations as have been stated. So this gives you a sense of how VRI is working today. Who knows what the future might hold? Maybe more access for deaf and hard of hearing people here in the United States and throughout the world. And with that, I think that wraps us up for the day. Thank you very much, and I look forward to working with all of you. I hope that you reach out to the NAD should you have any questions about VRI and consumers' rights with VRI. Thank you very much.